That. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Angie Sosa. I'm the Associate Director for Off-Campus Engagement. I'm joined today by my colleague, Wenmo. Wenmo, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hi, everybody. I'm Wenma Poya, Associate Director of Financial Aid.
Awesome. And today we're going to be going over some of the basics of living off campus, things to really start considering. If this is something that you are thinking about, we'll give you some details as it relates to various aspects of being on campus, whether it's applying for on-campus housing, if you're receiving financial aid, if you're a student who are thinking about studying abroad, etc. So this is a very overarching, broad conversation that we're going to have. Feel free to put any questions in the chat box or in the Q&A. I'm not sure which one's showing up for you all. But because Wenmo and I will be doing the presentation, we may not be able to get to your Q&As right away, but we'll do our best to answer them along the way, and hopefully we'll have those answers during the event and afterwards. As we said, this is a recording, so you should be able to view this at a later date on our YouTube page, which you can find a link to on the off-campus engagement page at tufts.edu. So without further ado, we'll kind of get started here. All right. So the general overview of today, we're going to talk about general live-on requirements and what the on-campus housing waitlist looks like for students who have applied to live in on-campus housing. We'll talk about a basic timeline for students who are thinking about living off campus, the differences between living on campus and off campus, if there are certain concerns that you might have about like resources that are available, what the finances look like, etc. For students who are considering studying abroad, that can be a big challenge because of the on-campus ability for you all to live on campus, as well as what challenges you might face with going abroad and living off campus. We'll talk a lot about budgeting, financial aid, and how that potentially plays into things, as well as resources, health and wellness resources, and general challenges that you may experience while living off campus. And then we'll have some time for questions. This is intended to be anywhere from 40 minutes to 55 minutes or so. Again, ask your questions and we'll get started. So for students who are living in on-campus housing, there is a 2-year live-on requirement. It is usually those first 2 years that you are here at the university. We've got students who may request an exemption for that requirement due to medical or religious reasons, and that process should either go through the Office of Equal Opportunity or us here in Residential Life. Our director would oversee those requests. There are very few students who fall into this category, but they do exist. For those who are rising or current sophomores, rising juniors next year, this is something that you will have to start thinking about based on available spaces that are on campus. If you are interested in living on campus, we definitely recommend applying for on-campus housing, that application which is open today. And I believe will be open until around the 3rd week of October. You'll have to check the website for the exact date of that. And the selection process and all of that will happen around November and December. For students who receive a lottery number through that on-campus housing application process, you are guaranteed a place on campus. Students who are interested in potentially living in theme and special interest spaces may also run into that as well, though the processes are a little bit different, even though they're both considered on-campus housing. For students who are planning to go abroad, you will need to complete a global education intent form, which must be completed by November 1st. We receive that information and that alerts us in terms of where students are in the process, if they have intentions of remaining on campus for that full year, etc. When we are looking at students who have applied for on-campus housing, we are really paying attention to whether or not they have submitted that, because we are looking to house students for the entire year. There will be a webinar next Wednesday at, I believe, 12 p.m. that my colleagues in Residential Life and Learning will be doing about the rising junior and senior on-campus housing application process, and they'll be able to answer some questions there for you. For students who do not receive a lottery number. You will have the opportunity to opt into the housing wait list. That means if there is a space available on campus after we have concluded our proceedings, they will reach out to students in order of submission to determine whether or not there's a space available for you. So those are all things that could happen. We try to do them as early as possible for juniors and seniors, just so you have as much time as possible to research any additional housing needs that you may have. So when you're living on campus, some students may have medical, religious, or other specific needs that need to be met through the housing accommodation process. For students who are living off campus, whereas many of those things can be met just based on the nature of the space that is available that you're looking for, we do want to make sure that you all are aware that you are still covered under the Americans with Disability Act in relation to the types of spaces that you are accessing. There are going to be some things that a landlord can and can't do in terms of making it accessible for you. And so when you're looking for a space, those are all things that you really should be keeping in mind, whether that means access to a lower level floor or access to air conditioning units, et cetera, et cetera. And that will be a process that you will go through on your own through the search process. And if you have questions about actually dealing with that or managing that process, you can always reach out to us, or you can contact folks over in the Office of Equal Opportunity. If you're ever thinking that you are encountering a bias during that search process, or you're running into a situation where something that is a reasonable request is not being easily met by the landlord, we always encourage you to seek legal assistance or reach out to the Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination. They can be very helpful in helping ensure that you are able to access spaces that are going to fit your need, and then also that the landlords and whomever else may be participating in this type of behavior are held responsible. So for students who are on campus versus off campus, we want to make sure that you understand kind of some of the differences that we run into. And this does have a lot to do with people who may be looking at potentially signing leases right now. And so just to kind of go off of that, when you came to campus, when you were a first-year student, most of you may have been a first-year student here on campus, you would have been asked to complete the housing survey. The housing survey is something that we utilize to match students who have similar living preferences or methods, so that way that the living experience is a lot better. That means, we're collecting information on what's the general time you go to bed, how do you intend to use your living space, etc. And those are all things that we want to match together. Obviously, over the course of the year, you're going to be meeting new people, you're going to be making new friends, whether it's people in your buildings, your classes, shared interest groups, etc. And so when you're going into your sophomore year and beyond, many of those times you're going to be using those relationships that you have been building to kind of create potential roommate situations. When you're living on campus, the challenge that you may face with selecting your own roommate is you may not have considered some of those questions that are included in our housing survey, such as what time do you go to sleep, or what time do you wake up, or how do you intend to use your space? And maybe you did, and maybe some of that information has changed. But the positive thing with being on campus in that regard is if there is a need to seek out a room change, we can have you apply for a room change. We can see what options are available on campus to be able to move you to. And this is kind of helpful in really determining, whether or not we found a roommate that is going to best fit your need. Something we like to explain to students is that, even though you may be best of friends, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be the best roommates. Some of your best friends are not always the best roommates, and that's something that we want to consider. This obviously moves into what it looks like in your junior and senior year. If you're living on campus, you're still going to have the opportunity to likely select your housemates, which you may have chosen by the same methods. But we will see over years, what our room change process and request process actually looks like. We see a much lower number of requests for room changes in the first year versus in the other years. And we've noticed that a lot of that does have to do with how roommates have been selected. So when you're living off campus, you have to consider that as well. The difference there is that when you're living off campus, you're not going to have the opportunity for a room change request form or get out of your lease as early as possible because you're not necessarily really maybe meshing well with your roommates. And so when you're going to select your housemates, we want to make sure that you're asking those important questions. What is the space going to be utilized for? What are some of your non-negotiables and whatnot, and making sure that everybody is on the same page. With that said, when you're living off campus, you're no longer working with Tufts residential life in the same way that you would be when you're living on campus. There are no RAs. There are, very few people who can help you with mediating conversations with your roommates, but it doesn't mean that you're not going to have the same process. So having those important conversations is really beneficial. For those of you who are current sophomores, who may be rising juniors, who are thinking about potentially living off campus, I do want to just, kind of reiterate what your timeline kind of looks like, keeping in mind that, you have been at the university now for about a year. And so the people that you are potentially looking to sign a lease for or sign a lease with are people that you have known for a year. And in addition to that, you're signing a lease that will potentially begin a year from now, and a lot of relationships will potentially change over the course of the year. We're hoping that you all maintain your relationships and have great friendships moving forward. But in the realistic side of things, we do want to make sure that folks kind of keep that in mind. So we like to throw that in there just so you have that to think about when you sign that lease. You're agreeing to live with this group of people in this particular space for a year-long period, and that can be a really challenging thing. So in addition to all of the other things you really need to keep in mind, whether the cost is going to be beneficial, whether the location is going to be beneficial, you also have to consider, is this relationship going to be maintained? And those are all things that we want you all to consider. Students will ask, am I moving too fast? Am I moving too slow? I would say that it's never too early to educate yourself on the process or to start researching the process, but I am not always the best or the biggest proponent in signing a lease this early because of many of the things I've already said. I will also say that, considering supply and demand, there are a lot of spaces that say that they're available for rent right now, but that's a lot of times because there are landlords who are looking to secure tenants for the upcoming year. They know that there's a group of students currently who are looking to sign leases right now. Let's be honest here. You can have the greatest landlord, but if they're looking to sign a lease right now, they are profiting off of the stress over the situation. And so we want to make sure that you all understand that, recognizing that the prices might be a little bit higher. And those are things that may come down over the next few months as people are not signing leases as frequently as they are right now. Addition to that, if you're not 100% clear on the process, or even if you're not mostly clear on the process and you don't feel confident in what your selection process, this is going to be a very stressful process for you. So we want to ensure that you have as much information as possible, that you're not rushing into decisions, but also recognizing that the timeline is going to look somewhat different for everybody. For those of you who may have found a space, right now and you feel comfortable with signing that lease, that comfort level is going to look different from everybody. It's going to, largely depend on what your experience has been, what your circumstances have been, et cetera. And if you feel comfortable, I do urge you to kind of take that information and make your decision based on that. Don't, feel as though I haven't seen a lot of spaces and so I don't want to rush to make this decision, or that, what am I missing? Is something better going to come around? At the end of the day, you are signing a lease for a year. A year can be a long time, but a year is also not very long time. And so you really want to make sure that you're feeling comfortable in the process and really utilizing that comfort level to make your decisions. Here's just a brief breakdown of what our timeline kind of looks like. The spring of your first year, you're probably thinking about that. So that's last year when you were a rising sophomore, a continuing first year student. Over the summer, you were probably thinking a lot about this, having conversations with your current roommates or your soon-to-be roommates. You're currently thinking about a lot of this stuff, and you're going to be doing so in the next couple of semesters, whether it's preparing for a space, determining what you're going to look like in terms of your study abroad process, or trying to prepare for actually having that space. There are lots of things that we want you all to really consider. My biggest thing is to start considering finances. Finances are a huge deal. That plays into the study abroad. If studying abroad is something that you are interested in doing, consider that you will not be present in the space for a period of time. And that may mean that you will either need to find someone to be responsible for either living in or being, financially responsible for the space, or you are still going to be held responsible. I say this because, it is a very real thing. We have a large number of students who are applying for study abroad. Most of those students do end up going abroad, and so there are available spaces. We do have some methods to really help you all with navigating and finding people, but it is going to be a lot of work on your end. So we highly recommend starting that process a little bit early, learning about what the next steps are, and kind of going from there. I'm going to skip past this because it is a little bit similar, but I will say that for the most part, this is really just kind of deep diving into the thing, thinking about what those needs are, what you can afford, what the housing search looks like, et cetera, et cetera. You can always utilize the resources that are available on our web pages to help you with navigating that. The major differences between living on campus and off campus have a lot to do with length of time, how bills are paid, what items you are, responsible for providing for yourself, etc. Number one, when you're living on campus, you're on campus for a 9-month academic year, usually the months of September through May. There may be some times that you're on campus over the winter break or over the summer break. Those are slightly different than the rest of the time. But when you're living off campus, it is for a full academic year, or a full year, excuse me, not academic year. That is the 12-month period. There are going to be some leases and landlords who are offering much longer leases. I wouldn't recommend signing something for that long. I say that from the perspective of, if you haven't had the opportunity to live in that space for at least those first 12 months, how would you know that you want to stay there for the full 24, right? With that said, when you're living on campus versus living off campus, you're going to have a lot more freedom in terms of what you're able to do. There's more stipulations when you're living on campus. You sign what's called a housing license agreement versus as signing a rental lease. So that looks a little bit differently. There's certain things that you'll be allowed to do and not allowed to do, certain furniture that you can bring in or can't bring in, ways to decorate your space, ways that you can utilize your space. So at the end of the day, we want to make sure that you're reading both of those documents. If you're going to be living on campus, you want to read through that housing license agreement, and you can find that on our webpage. That is under housing policies and guidelines. There's a copy of it there for you to read through and make sure you understand the policies that are listed there. And when you're looking at off-campus housing, you want to make sure that you're reading through that rental lease and you're understanding those things. We do have some tips and tricks on our website that kind of say, like, these are the basic things that you should really be looking at in terms of a rental lease, the types of information that should be noted in that lease, etc. If you're working with a broker or even like a lawyer, maybe there's a family lawyer or something like that, they can go over those leases. Unfortunately, we're unable to go over the lease with you because it is a legal document and we're not legal representatives. However, we can give you some basic information as to what is or should be noted in those leases, and you can find that information on our website. When we're talking about finances and you're living on campus, most of that stuff is all in one payment. You've paid the rent, the utilities, all of those things for internet, heat, water, whatever the case is paid upfront each semester. When you're living off campus, that is a month-to-month payment that you have made an agreement with your landlord or the property manager. That information will be spelled out in that rental lease. Utilities are likely going to be separate. Most oftentimes, we've found that the landlords or the property managers are responsible for water, but that's really dependent on when the space was renovated, whether or not the space has a water meter, etc. Most oftentimes, students are going to be responsible for the gas and the electric bills. And those are going to be set up slightly different and separately in the individual student's name. So those are all things to really consider. Those are also questions that you're going to be asking the landlord. What type of internet can, be set up in this house? What is the electric provider? What is the gas provider, etc. Personal items are obviously going to look different as well when you're living in university housing. We provide housing furniture that includes bed, desk, dresser, and a wardrobe space. Much of that stuff is going to be things you need to provide for yourself when you're living off campus. And so, whether that means you are bringing it from home or locating lower cost items, we do have a partnership with Court Furniture that offers rental items where they come, they set it up, and you'll have a space or furniture and whatnot to use over the course of your lease, and then they'll come and remove it. There is a monthly fee that's associated with that, but that information is also on our page. There are also going to be things that you can and can't do when you're living in your off-campus space. And those are all bits of information you should really have the conversation with your landlord about. In both situations, this is that last thing that's there. We highly recommend getting renter's insurance. So renter's insurance can be really helpful in case of emergency. If there is a pipe burst or a fire, unfortunately, we've had a number of those over the last couple of years, and we want to ensure that your items are, protected. Landlord or a homeowner are going to have homeowner's insurance, and that's mostly going to cover the actual physical structure of the house. That's going to cover some of the appliances like a stove or, the sink, the refrigerator, etc. But when it comes to your personal items, such as bedding, clothing, furniture, television, computer supplies, all of those things, those will not be covered under the homeowner's insurance. Similarly, when living on campus, it's not something that is covered under university insurance either. So in order to ensure that those things are covered, we recommend getting renter's insurance. If your family owns their own home, you may be able to get an addition to their policy. So that would be something we definitely recommend following up with your parents or your guardian's homeowner's insurance, just to see if that's something that can be extended to your on or off campus living arrangement. But for those of you who do not have that opportunity, renter's insurance is fairly accessible and fairly low cost. Oftentimes, $10 to $15 per month, depending on the insurer that you go with. But we definitely highly recommend looking into that and finding something that is going to cover all of your particular needs, just in case of emergency. Studying abroad, as I've kind of mentioned, is a really challenging thing that students run into a lot. The junior-senior deadline for on-campus housing application is due in October, whereas the study abroad intent form will be due on November 1st. We get the information from the study abroad group as to who has completed that study abroad intent form, because that is how we will also determine who is receiving a lottery number versus who is ineligible for a lottery number. With that said, if you are someone who is planning to study abroad and are looking for off-campus housing, whether you've signed a lease or you're looking for a sublet or anything of the sort, we have a number of resources that we can point you to help navigate that process. That includes our off-campus Canvas page. So if you just go to the Canvas page and search off-campus engagement, it should bring you there. We also have a link to it on our Tufts off-campus engagement page. So you can click that and just kind of self-add. You can connect with students through the message boards there. We also have a subletting e-list, which the link is also available on our website, where you can fill out a quick form, let us know a little bit about you. Do you have a space, or are you looking for a space? What's your budget? What type of environment are you looking to live in? And we'll go through and manually match you with people whose criteria matches your own. And over a period of time, you can connect with those students to kind of determine what works. We have our off-campus housing website, which is partnered through apartments.com, and that's just offcampus.tufts.edu, which you can research roommates and see available spaces there. You would utilize your Tufts credentials to sign in there. If you have access to Facebook or anything like that, lots of families are posting on the Facebook families page, or the Tufts families page, specifically posting their sublets. We do ask that they kind of like move it over to our subletting e-list, so that way students have a little bit more access to it as opposed to waiting to hear from their parents on who may have responded. But there's also lots of Facebook pages to check out. I will say that when you go on Facebook, if you see something that says Tufts off-campus housing, that is not something that is managed through our office. We don't have a Facebook page per se. Many of those pages are pages that have been left over from years prior. We are not admins on those pages, so we don't have have any control over the information that's in there. And because they are public pages, they are far more likely to get people of all different walks, which means that you could potentially get scammed in those pages. So scamming is a real thing. We want to make sure that folks understand that. You can find it in Facebook pages. You can find it on apartments.com or Zillow or Canvas or anything like that. And anywhere that you are looking for off-campus housing, whether it is for the full year or for even a sublet, we do urge you to use your due diligence and really understanding and asking lots of questions of those folks. So that was a big, really quick overview of most of the general stuff, and we're going to jump into finances. I do have a slide or two, and then I'm going to pass it over to Wenmo, who'll give us some information from the financial aid perspective. First, what we're going to start with is what the typical costs are. Most frequently, the rent cost that we're seeing per person, not including utilities, is in the area of $800 to $1,300 per month. That number can fluctuate depending on a variety of different things. I have most frequently been seeing the range being around $1,150 to $1,200. And I do have another slide that gives a little bit of an update on the broker situation out here in the state of Massachusetts. Well, I'll be able to kind of share some more detail there in a bit. But I would also recommend that students are also factoring in approximately $150 per month per person for utilities. That includes gas, electric, internet, and water if water is included. That number will be variable depending on how often those things are used. And also consider that that number will, vary based on how many people live in the space. But having a nice round number to kind of like work with as a just in case number can really be helpful. So I always approximate about $150. That can give or take. One of the things that you can do when you're selecting a space is contacting the utility companies earlier to say, hey, I'm going to be living at this particular address in the area, and I'm just trying to gauge what is the approximate monthly cost for gas or electric. So that way you can kind of approximate what's going to be best for your budget. Food, transportation, and personal items are all variable. That's really dependent on your intake and your use, the location where you're living, and items that you need. We highly recommend utilizing our budget worksheet, which you can find a link to on our resources page. It gives you a little bit of information on how to figure out proper budgeting techniques. Finding other ways to properly budget, whether utilizing a wholesale club with, splitting some costs with your housemates can be beneficial. If you are a student who has a vehicle, do you need your vehicle? Will you need to pay for parking? Does the house that you're looking at have a driveway? Is it an additional cost to have that parking space available? So lots of things to really consider that will hit you in the pockets. That is really something we highly recommend looking at. Pass it over to you, Wenmo.
Yeah, thanks, Angie. All right, so a big question that we get from a lot of students when they're asking financial aid is, will my aid change if I live off campus? And the answer is no. What changes really is what you pay and to whom. So we'll kind of go over that in the next couple slides. And so the reason is the way we calculate aid is the same for a student who, whether they live on campus or off campus. And when I speak to sophomores, I'll say, hey, are you on financial aid? Well, if you are a junior and you were living off campus, your aid package, your aid decision would have been exactly the same. And that's because we assume the same costs in our cost of attendance, which is kind of like the foundation of figuring out aid. So we have tuition and fees, which are obviously charged on the Tufts bill. And then there's housing and food, which is charged if you're living on campus or you have a meal plan. And then out-of-pocket costs like books and supplies, personal expenses. So if you're living off campus, we assume the same cost. So we're assuming the cost of a first or second year room for a sophomore or first year student, and then also the cost of a Tufts full plan. So it's the same whether you live on or off campus. Then we calculate the family contribution based on the aid application documents we have and the income and assets that your family has. And the difference between that is the need, which we fulfill with aid depending on your eligibility. So all that is exactly the same. The difference is that, if you're living off campus, you're not going to be charged for a room. You may have a lower cost meal plan. You may not have a meal plan at all. So what you would normally pay to Tufts, now you're paying elsewhere. Another thing to keep in mind is that regardless if you're living on or off campus, financial aid kind of rules require us to just account for the 9 months of the academic year. So you may have a lease that's for 12 months, but the aid can't really account for that at all. So that's kind of like the basic overview, kind of starting off when people ask, is my aid going to change? And the answer is no. So yeah, why don't we go to the next slide? Um, so this is kind of like more of a detail about kind of what I was mentioning before. So if you're living off campus, and actually before I go on, I just want to say that, so when I give this example to sophomores saying, hey, look at your aid package this year, it would have been the same if you're living off campus. One caveat to that is in future years, obviously tough students are aware you have to apply for aid separately every year. So we always tell people if your family circumstances, all those things are pretty similar, then the level of aid is similar. So this can't really account for if there's any changes in a future year. It's just kind of looking at your current award as an example. So it's not that it's like preset in the future. So that's something to keep in mind. And moving on to this. So as I mentioned before, if you're living off campus, Tufts is not going to bill you for a room because you didn't participate in the room lottery. So, sometimes people will look at their award decision letter and it shows the budget and they're like, wait, I'm living off campus. Why does it show a room here? And really, that's the budget that we use to figure out how much aid that we might need to give in the end. Because if we took that out, assuming that you don't need to live someplace or eat, then you'd get less aid. But we're not doing that. So the big difference is when you get your bill in July and November, you're not being charged for a room by Tufts because you're not living on campus. You have the option to just not have a meal plan and, get groceries and cook, or you might have a meal plan that's smaller than what you had in your first or second year because you're not going to be in the dining halls as much, but maybe you want to nab a few meals here or there. So that balance is lower. But the aid, like I said, is calculated the same way. So if you have a similar award, your grants and any accepted loans are credited to your student account. And so really what happens there is dependent on how much aid you get. So a lot of students will ask, well, hey, am I going to get money back for living off campus? My friend got something. The thing to know is there's no preset money that's given by Tufts to students just because they're living off campus. So there's no like, oh, you live off campus, here's your off campus money. It really depends on your level of aid. So if you're someone who had a small amount of aid, and again, you have small amount of aid when you're living off campus, because your charges are lower, it just means that you're paying less to Tufts. And the money that you might have paid to Tufts before, now you're going to pay that directly to a landlord and pay for utilities and food and things of that nature. Now, if you're a student who's on the other end of the spectrum, where you had a high amount of aid and maybe it covered all your charges, well, now you are a student who is likely to see a credit on your account. At the start of the semester because your charges are less, but your aid is similar. So there's that credit. And in that case, then you would have a refund. And that refund amount is really dependent on that math. So again, it's not like there's a preset number. Okay, this is how much a room costs, so we're giving that exact number. No, it's really dependent on how much your aid is and how much your charges are and the difference between that. Now, if you're one of those people who's in that situation, and also another thing to mention is there are some families who might borrow loans to help cover their costs of their paying their bill when they were living on campus. And you can still borrow those loans similarly if you're living off campus, and that might create a credit for you. So it's borrowed, but you might have a credit because what you're not getting charged from Tufts, you can still borrow to help pay for. So if you do have that credit, it's a negative balance. The student account balance insists that line is really the bottom line of whether you owe money. If it's a regular number, that's how much you owe. If it's zero, nothing needs to be done. But if it's a negative number, then when all your money comes in, because sometimes there's funds that don't get paid up front. So if it's a loan or something that has to wait till the semester starts, once all that money comes in, and you have a credit, you can request a refund. Now, the thing to keep in mind is that the billing office only starts processing refunds on the first day of classes. So typically, if you request a refund, you're going to get that money, within they say 7 to 10 business days. So it might be up to a couple weeks, because so many people are requesting refunds at the beginning of the semester. So if you have that money and it gets transferred to your bank account, now it's your responsibility to budget any of those funds to help pay your costs over the course of the semester. So like Andrew was mentioning before, budgeting is very important. And if you have a refund, if you're in that situation, it's all just coming to you as a lump sum, and you have to figure out how to apportion it as over the course of the months in that semester. Um, and as I mentioned before, if you're used to borrowing loans to help pay costs, you could still do that if you're living off campus. Yeah, we can go to the next one. Um, so yeah, so this is kind of a breakdown of when you're looking for apartments, looking for accommodations. And so uh, this doesn't have, yeah, so this has the updated numbers that we use in 25, 26. And so this is how we break it down. We say, okay, the housing costs that we use in our cost of attendance, again, that's based on the cost of average cost of a room for a first or second year student. And then food is based on the tough full plan. And so we divide it, as you notice, for 9 months for the academic year. So we add all that up, and basically over the 9 months, if you're looking for an apartment, you want it to, not exceed about 2,200 per month for rent, food, utilities, all the things. So that's kind of like your target rate. And obviously it's a little bit lower if you're dividing by 12, if you're trying to figure out, because you have a 12-month lease. And that, and as I mentioned before, we're not able to account for that with aid, unfortunately. So, you're going to have to figure out how to pay those other months of rent, the upfront costs, maybe the summer costs. So maybe getting a sublet, or maybe you're working during the summer and paying for that rent. But those are things that are kind of like a little more involved than living on campus, because you kind of have to figure out these extra months if you're someone who's like thinking about aid, and also the upfront costs, which unfortunately financially is not really able to help with either. But when you're looking, that's kind of like a nice ballpark number that you keep in mind, that you don't want your total cost, and it's not just the rent. It's the rent, the utilities, all the food, all those other related costs. Over a 9 month period, you want to keep it under 2,100. And obviously, if you're kind of like budgeting and stretching it out, then you may do it divided by 12. Just keep in mind, again, aid is not going to count for those 3 months. But if you want to say, okay, realistically, we want to make this stretch out, so we may want to use that lower number. So yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So
Mhm.
this slide kind of does a breakdown, similar to what Wenmo was just saying, in terms of the number that we're looking at for like a month to month. You'll see the first two slides, that first slide, that orange slide, if you're using financial aid, how financial aid is determined is based on the first and second year housing costs. So that number is what the housing rent would be per month based on that number. We've also included kind of the food and the meal plan, the most popular ones that are typically utilized during the students' participation here on campus and whatnot, as well as what that general cost is going to look like month to month, as well as over the 9 month period that you're living in on-campus housing. We've also included in that second column junior and senior costs, what the housing would look like for the junior and senior group who are living on campus, with similar breakdown of meal plans, as well as what the cost looks like from month to month, as well as over that 9 month period, as well as that final column off campus, living off campus for the 12 month period, breaking down the rent, breaking down what utilities typically cost, what you might be spending on food. You obviously see there's a big difference in the food price. You are able to get an on-campus meal plan if that's something that you're interested in doing, but obviously cooking your own meals off campus is going to look a little bit different. The amount of food that you're purchasing is going to be different. When you're paying for food on campus, you're not only paying for the actual food itself, you're paying for the preparation of the food, you're paying for all of those things. So there's lots of stuff that goes into that. Transportation and personal are going to look different, etc. And that price is also going to change. But as you can see, just across the board, the cost between utilizing financial aid or living on campus as a junior senior is going to be very similar to what the cost of living off campus is for a 12-month period. The breakdown is mostly going to be in how it's budgeted, what months it's going to, et cetera, et cetera. So highly recommend taking a screenshot of this page or coming back to it and taking a look at it once it's on our YouTube page. That way you can have an understanding of what it is you're looking at financially. Also, with all of this said, not everybody's financial aid is going to look the same. So if you are a student who is receiving financial aid, we highly recommend meeting with your financial aid representative to get a little bit more understanding of what your particular situation is. So, going back to the conversation about brokers' fees, upfront fees, those are all very important. There have been some recent changes in the state of Massachusetts in refers to what the brokers' fee situation is. Number one, we're going to talk about what those upfront fees are. So, that is this bottom section here, upfront fees that you should be aware of. Most oftentimes, when you're looking to sign a lease and you're looking to move in, you're going to be required to pay around 2 to 3 months upfront. possibly including a broker's fee if you're working with one, and I'll explain that a little bit more. Those upfront fees are going to be your first month rent, so the first month that your lease is covering, the last month that your lease would be covering, potentially a security deposit, which shouldn't be more than the amount of 1 month's rent. So if there's four people living in your house and the rent for the entire month is $4,000, the security deposit shouldn't be any more than $4,000. So $1,000 per person, right? If you're working with a broker, that means you have created a contract with the broker to find you a space. You are responsible for the broker's fee, which should be no more than the amount of 1 month's rent. So again, if the amount of the rent for the entirety of the space for people, excuse me, is $4,000, the broker's fee would be no more than $4,000. A broker's fee is basically a finder's fee. You're paying a broker or an agent to do the work for you. People might ask, well, what's a broker? What's an agent? What's a realtor? They're kind of, three different versions of the same thing. They're the person that's there to kind of help you with navigating that thing. They can create contracts either with you, the potential renter who is looking for a space, or they can create a contract with the landlord or the property manager to list their space and try and find them renters. So the question you might ask was like, okay, well, if my broker is working with the landlord or the property manager, who's responsible for paying that? Well, in the state of Massachusetts, as effective of August 1st, the broker is working with with the landlord or the property manager. So that person or that entity is responsible for paying that bill. Now, with that said, the brokers and the landlords, or the landlords, excuse me, they're not supposed to take that difference in cost and add it to your bill. That doesn't mean that's not going to happen. You want to make sure that everything in your lease is making sense. So this goes back to the cost that I was mentioning, where we're looking at $800 per month to $1,300 per month. Say, for instance, the landlord has decided that they're going to take the cost of that broker's fee and they're going to apply it to your bill. So instead of you paying $1,300 a month, maybe you're going to pay $1,350 or $1,375 or whatever it works out to be over those 12-month periods. That might not be spelled out in your lease. It may not say that you're going to be covering the cost of the broker's fee. If it does, that's something you need to call attention to, because that is not allowed in the state of Massachusetts. However, with that said, it is important to recognize that it is possible that it will happen. So be aware of that, which is why we can give you a general range of what your rent could look like. But honestly, there's nothing that says that a landlord has to charge X amount. That is something that the landlord can be determining on their own. Most oftentimes, they're going to base their rent costs on what the rest of the market is doing. So if most of the spaces in the area are charging $1,500 a month, they can charge $1,500 a month. They can charge $1,600 a month. They might want to charge less because you might be more likely to go for it. And this also goes back to the conversation point that I brought up earlier with waiting a little bit before you're signing that lease. Signing your leases right now, there's a lot of people who are looking to sign leases right now. The prices are high because there's a big demand for it. That just goes back to the basic principles of supply and demand. However, with time, as less people are looking for spaces, the cost will potentially come down. So we highly recommend just kind of taking your time. But once you feel comfortable, if you feel comfortable today, tomorrow, or the next day, and you want to sign your lease and you're okay with the price and you're okay with the location and all of those things, then by means, feel free to sign your lease. However, if you want to wait, that's okay too. We have had plenty of students who have signed their lease, a month beforehand, 2 months beforehand, whatever the case is. Outside of the college setting, outside of this particular area, most people are signing their leases within a month or so of moving in. So that is not unheard of. It is basically what the normal society does. So you're ready to begin your search. Same as we mentioned earlier, there's lots of different ways that you're going to be able to find stuff, whether through Facebook, through word of mouth, Craigslist, Zillow, apartments.com, through the off-campus at tufts.edu main page, talking to friends, or whatever the case is. At the end of the day, whichever way you end up locating a space, we want to make sure that you're asking lots of questions, that you're going to see the space in person. You're not handing money to someone that you haven't met yet. You haven't seen the space, because we don't want you to get scammed. There are some, helpful articles and tips and tricks on our webpage on how to avoid scams, things to kind of look out for. So we definitely recommend looking into those things. And in addition to that, we want to make sure that you know what questions that are going to be beneficial for you to ask. So you can check out our website to kind of see what those typical questions are, etc. And if there's other questions that you have, you can always reach out to us. We're just at offcampusinfo@tufts.edu, and we can help kind of navigate some of that with you or talk through some of the challenges that you're facing. Some of the stuff we want to make sure that you're doing is having tough conversations, both with yourself, with your friends, with your families, understanding that even the best of friends can make some not so great housemates. So, really understanding that you all are getting what you need to live comfortably in your space. Understanding that leaving an off campus apartment is not simple at all. Sometimes finding a subletter can be very challenging. Sometimes finding someone to take over the entirety of your lease can be really challenging and difficult. It can be an expensive process. And so we want to make sure that you're doing everything you can on the front end to make a better decision for when you have to live in this space. Health and wellness opportunities are still available on campus. So that means access to the Tufts dining plans, health services, counseling and mental health services, student support. You can always reach out to our office to kind of manage some of those things. We'll be sending monthly newsletters and social media advertisements and whatnot to advertise tips and tricks for living off campus, things to think about at certain times of the year, places that might be holding some student discounts, et cetera, et cetera. Other ways to maintain your involvement while living off campus. I can imagine that when you're living off campus, a little bit further from campus, you're not always here. So you're not necessarily in the mix of things, but we want to make sure that you still have a tie to our campus. So reaching out to us is going to be huge for you. And then also we've got our general resources that are going to be helpful for you. You can visit us online at our offcampus.tufts.edu page to use to search for housing resources. You can go to our regular Tufts page. You can go to the financial aid page, and you can always reach out to student services to set up an appointment either with our office or with someone from financial aid to really help you out. So 12:49, I managed to do that in 47 minutes. That is great. I am going to stop the recording now. And